June 4, 1942. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to the first pale streaks of light over the Pacific. The same man who had commanded the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now led the most powerful naval strike force in the world toward what he believed would be another crushing victory. 4 massive fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through the swells, their decks laden with over 250 of Japan's finest aircraft and most experienced pilots. The Imperial Japanese Navy had never tasted defeat in modern warfare. Their carrier-based aviation had proven unstoppable from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, sinking Allied battleships and carriers with impunity. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval strategy, had crafted what appeared to be an unassailable plan to lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle near Midway Atoll. Intelligence suggested the Americans possessed only 2 operational carriers against Japan's 4, making victory seem inevitable. What Nagumo could not have known was that American codebreakers had achieved the impossible. Deep within the basement of Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had cracked Japan's most secret naval cipher, JN-25. Every detail of Operation MI, the Japanese code name for the Midway assault, had been laid bare to American eyes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. The Americans had positioned their forces with surgical precision. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, carried the carriers Enterprise and Hornet with their escort vessels. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the recently repaired Yorktown, had taken position northeast of Midway. Though outnumbered in ships and aircraft, the Americans possessed something far more valuable than material superiority. They knew their enemy's every move. As dawn broke on June 4th, Nagumo launched his first wave of bombers and fighters against Midway's airfield, confident that this would be merely the opening act of another Japanese triumph. 108 aircraft roared off the carrier's decks, their rising sun markings gleaming in the morning light. The pilots, veterans of countless victories, expected to return to prepare for the destruction of whatever American ships dared to challenge them. But unbeknownst to the Japanese commander, American search planes were already airborne, scanning the vast ocean for signs of the enemy fleet. At approximately 600 hours, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a Catalina flying boat from Midway, spotted the massive Japanese formation steaming toward the atoll. His radio crackled to life with the message that would change the course of the war. Enemy carriers bearing 320, distance 150 miles. The trap was set. 4 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were sailing directly into the most devastating naval ambush in history, completely unaware that their opponent held all the cards. The morning sun climbed higher as Nagumo's first wave pounded Midway's defenses. Bombs crashed into the airfield, fuel dumps erupted in towering columns of black smoke, and American defensive positions disappeared under a hail of explosives. Yet even as his pilots reported successful strikes, disturbing news began to filter back to the Japanese flagship. American aircraft from Midway, obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters and ancient Devastator torpedo bombers, were launching desperate counterattacks against the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the strike against Midway, radioed back a message that would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack. The American airfield, though damaged, remained operational. Nagumo faced a critical decision that would determine the fate of his fleet, and perhaps the entire Pacific War. His carrier's hangars held a second wave of aircraft, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes specifically intended for use against American warships. Should he launch them immediately against the reported enemy fleet, or rearm them with land attack munitions for another strike on Midway? The decision seemed obvious to Nagumo. No American fleet had been definitively located, and Midway's airfield posed an immediate threat to his operations. At 7:15 hours, he issued the order that would seal his fate. Prepare to carry out second attack on Midway. Re-equip attack planes with bombs. Deepen the carrier's hangars Japanese ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching weapons. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs designed to sink warships were wheeled away, replaced with high-explosive bombs intended for land targets. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks as mechanics topped off fuel tanks. It was precision work that required time. Time that Nagumo believed he possessed in abundance. At 7:28 hours, that assumption shattered. A message from the cruiser, Tone's search plane, crackled through the radio. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The phantom American fleet was real, and it was closing fast. Panic began to creep into Japanese communications. Within minutes, another message arrived. Enemy ships appear to be 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo hesitated. Cruisers and destroyers, while dangerous, hardly justified abandoning the Midway strike. But then came the message that changed everything. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The word carrier electrified the Japanese command structure. Everything Yamamoto had planned, the destruction of the American Pacific Fleet, suddenly hung in the balance. Nagumo faced an agonizing choice: continue rearming for the second Midway strike, or immediately prepare to engage the American fleet. Each option carried enormous risks, and time was rapidly running out. As Japanese ordnance crews scrambled to reverse their work, switching back to anti-ship weapons, the first wave of American attackers was already thundering toward the Japanese fleet from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The battle that would determine control of the Pacific was about to begin, and Admiral Nagumo had no idea that his every move had been anticipated by an enemy who knew his plans better than many of his own officers. At 9:25 hours, the obsolete American torpedo bombers found their target. 15 Douglas Devastator aircraft from Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the Hornet approached the Japanese fleet in a scene that would become legendary for both its courage and its tragedy. These lumbering, fabric-covered aircraft represented the best torpedo bombers America possessed, yet they were hopelessly outclassed by Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his squadron in a low-altitude attack run against the carrier Soryu. The Devastators, flying barely 50 feet above the waves, made perfect targets for the swarm of Zeros that descended upon them like angry hornets. One by one, the American aircraft burst into flames and crashed into the Pacific. Waldron's plane was among the first to fall, the squadron commander dying at the controls as his aircraft disintegrated under Japanese fire. Behind Torpedo Squadron 8 came the Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. The pattern repeated with heartbreaking consistency. Brave American aircrew pressing home their attacks against impossible odds, only to be cut down by superior Japanese fighters and devastating anti-aircraft fire. Of the 41 Devastators that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 would return to their carriers. Not a single torpedo found its mark. From his position on Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo watched the destruction of the American torpedo squadrons with grim satisfaction. The enemy pilots had shown remarkable courage, but courage alone could not overcome the technological and tactical superiority of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His Zero fighters had performed magnificently, and his fleet remained unscathed. The morning's action seemed to confirm everything Japanese naval doctrine had taught about the invincibility of properly defended carrier forces. What Nagumo could not see was the strategic disaster unfolding around him. The doomed torpedo attacks had drawn his defensive fighter screen down to sea level, where Zeros pursued the lumbering Devastators through deadly anti-aircraft fire. Japanese combat air patrol aircraft, originally positioned at high altitude to defend against dive bombers, had descended to help destroy the torpedo planes. The sky above the Japanese fleet, for the first time since the battle began, was virtually undefended. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours. His aircraft were running dangerously low on fuel when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed. The destroyer Arashi had been delayed by a futile attack on the American submarine Nautilus, and was now desperately trying to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey made the intuitive decision that would change naval history. He followed the destroyer's wake. At 10:22 hours, McCluskey's dive bombers crested a cloud layer and found themselves directly above the Japanese carrier formation. 4 massive flat tops steamed in a defensive box, their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for the next strike. Below them, the sea churned with the wakes of destroyers and cruisers, while overhead, the sky stood empty of defending fighters. The moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability had arrived, and the Americans were perfectly positioned to exploit it. According to naval historian Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, what happened next would demonstrate that in naval warfare, timing and luck could prove more decisive than superior numbers or technology. The pride of the Japanese fleet, masters of the Pacific for 6 months, were about to learn that even the mightiest forces could be humbled by an enemy who refused to surrender. At 10:24 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey rolled his Dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive toward the carrier Kaga. Behind him, 32 more Dauntless aircraft followed in perfect formation, their pilots squinting through their bomb sights at targets that seemed too good to be true. The Japanese carriers lay spread beneath them like toys in a bathtub, their flight decks packed with aircraft, fuel lines, and ammunition. Not a single defending fighter rose to challenge them. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck Kaga near her island superstructure at precisely 10:26 hours. The explosion detonated aviation fuel and ammunition stored on the hangar deck, creating a chain reaction that turned the massive carrier into a floating inferno. Secondary explosions rippled through her hull, as stored torpedoes and bombs added their destructive power to the conflagration. Within minutes, Kaga was transformed from the pride of the Imperial Navy into a burning wreck. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Richard Best led a second group of Enterprise dive bombers against the flagship Akagi. Best's bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, igniting refueling aircraft and triggering devastating secondary explosions. Admiral Nagumo watched in horror as his flagship, the same vessel from which he had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, became a blazing tomb for hundreds of his finest aircrew and mechanics. But the American attack was far from over. At the same moment McCluskey's Enterprise squadrons struck their targets, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown against the carrier Soryu. Leslie had lost his bomb due to a mechanical malfunction, but his squadron pressed home their attack with deadly accuracy. 3 direct hits transformed Soryu into the 3rd Japanese carrier to suffer catastrophic damage in less than 5 minutes. The speed and coordination of the American attack defied belief. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers, vessels that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, lay burning and helpless. The carefully planned Japanese operation to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had been reversed in a span of time shorter than a coffee break. Thousands of Japanese sailors and airmen, the elite of their nation's naval forces, were trapped aboard ships that had become floating furnaces. From his position on the surviving carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched the destruction with a mixture of rage and admiration. His 3 sister ships were clearly doomed, their decks buckled by explosions and their superstructures wreathed in flames that reached hundreds of feet into the sky. The careful tactical formation that had seemed so invincible an hour earlier was now a scene of unprecedented disaster. Yet Yamaguchi refused to accept defeat. Hiryu remained operational, and her flight deck still carried enough aircraft to mount a counterstrike. If the Japanese could not achieve the decisive victory Yamamoto had planned, they might still inflict enough damage on the American fleet to salvage something from the disaster. At 11:45 hours, Yamaguchi launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the last known position of the American carriers. The Battle of Midway was far from over, but the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably in the span of 5 minutes. Japanese naval supremacy, built over decades and proven in countless victories, had been shattered by American determination and superior intelligence. The carriers that had brought war to Pearl Harbor now burned beneath the same Pacific sun, their smoke columns visible for 50 miles as monuments to the price of overconfidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover from this single devastating blow. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi's counterstrike found its target at 12:10 hours on June 4th. 18 Japanese VAL dive bombers, guided by the smoke from their own burning carriers, located Task Force 17 and prepared to extract revenge for the morning's catastrophe. The carrier Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea battle just 1 month earlier, stood as the primary target for Japanese fury. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had prepared his ship well for the approaching storm. Yorktown's damage control teams, seasoned by their recent battle experience, had sealed fuel lines, flooded magazines, and positioned firefighting equipment throughout the vessel. The carrier's defensive armament, 40mm anti-aircraft guns and 50-caliber machine guns, tracked the incoming Japanese aircraft as combat air patrol fighters dove to intercept. Despite fierce American resistance, 3 Japanese bombs found their mark. The first penetrated Yorktown's flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among parked aircraft. The second bomb struck near the island's superstructure, killing and wounding dozens of sailors while disrupting communications. The third and most damaging hit ruptured the carrier's hull near the engineering spaces, causing progressive flooding and reducing her speed to just 6 knots. For 2 hours, Yorktown's damage control teams fought to save their ship with a skill that impressed even their enemies. Chief Warrant Officer John Greenbacker led teams through smoke-filled compartments, shoring up bulkheads and pumping out flooded spaces. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich directed firefighting efforts that brought the hangar deck blazes under control. By 2 o'clock, Yorktown was making 15 knots and appeared to have survived the worst of her ordeal. But Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. At 2:45 hours, he launched a second strike, 10 Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. This attack would prove even more devastating than the first. Flying barely 50 feet above the waves, the Japanese torpedo planes approached Yorktown from multiple angles, forcing her escorts to divide their defensive fire. 2 Type 91 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, their explosions rupturing fuel tanks and flooding additional compartments. The carrier developed a dangerous list to port that threatened to capsize her. Captain Buckmaster faced an agonizing decision: continue fighting to save his ship, or order abandoned ship to preserve the lives of his crew. As Yorktown's list increased beyond 15 degrees, he made the painful choice that would haunt him for years to come. All hands abandon ship. Buckmaster's voice echoed through the carrier's communication system at 3 o'clock. Hundreds of sailors began the orderly evacuation of the vessel that had served as their home and fighting platform. Destroyers moved alongside to take off survivors while Yorktown settled deeper into the Pacific swells, her flight deck awash and her island listing severely to port. Yet even as Yorktown fought for survival, American forces were preparing to complete the destruction of the Japanese fleet. The surviving carrier Hiryu had revealed her position by launching the attacks against Yorktown, and American search planes had pinpointed her location. At 4:30 hours, 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, rolled into their attack dives against the last operational Japanese carrier. 4 direct hits sealed Hiryu's fate within minutes. Like her 3 sister ships, she erupted into flames as aviation fuel and ammunition detonated throughout her hull. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his flagship was doomed, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the disgrace of survival. At 7:23 hours on June 5th, Hiryu joined Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu on the bottom of the Pacific, carrying with her the last remnants of Japanese carrier aviation supremacy. As dawn broke on June 5, 1942, the damaged carrier Yorktown floated dead in the water, her crew evacuated and her fate seemingly sealed. Captain Buckmaster and a skeleton damage control party had returned aboard during the night, hoping to save the vessel that had contributed so decisively to the previous day's victory. Working by flashlight in flooded compartments, they managed to correct some of the carrier's list and restore partial power to her engines. The destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide power and pumping assistance, while the minesweeper Vireo took Yorktown under tow. For several hours it appeared that American determination and seamanship might yet save the battle-damaged carrier. Her hull remained intact despite the torpedo damage, and her engineering spaces showed signs of gradual recovery. Admiral Fletcher, observing from the cruiser Astoria, began to hope that Yorktown might yet reach Pearl Harbor for repairs. Unknown to the Americans, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe aboard the Japanese submarine I-168 had been stalking the damaged carrier since early morning. Tanabe represented one of Japan's most experienced submarine commanders, and his vessel carried a full load of Type 95 torpedoes, specifically designed for attacks against major warships. The slow-moving Yorktown and her escorts presented an irresistible target for a commander seeking to salvage some measure of revenge from the previous day's disaster. At 1:36 hours on June 5th, Tanabe maneuvered I-168 into perfect attack position. From a range of 1,200 yards, point-blank distance for submarine warfare, he fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the stationary American ships. The Type 95 weapons ran straight and true, their wake trails barely visible in the afternoon sunlight. The first torpedo struck Yorktown amidships, ripping a massive hole in her starboard side and flooding additional compartments that had been slowly recovering from the previous day's damage. The second torpedo found an even more devastating target. The destroyer Hammond moored alongside the carrier to provide assistance. The explosion broke Hammond's back, and she sank within minutes, taking 81 of her crew to the bottom of the Pacific. Captain Buckmaster watched helplessly as his ship absorbed the fatal blow. The new torpedo damage, combined with the previous day's wounds, finally overwhelmed Yorktown's reserve buoyancy. Her list increased rapidly as thousands of tons of seawater poured through ruptured bulkheads. At 2 o'clock, Buckmaster again ordered abandon ship, this time knowing that his vessel was truly beyond salvation. The carrier Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea and hero of Midway, rolled onto her port side at dawn on June 6th. Her island superstructure disappeared beneath the waves first, followed by her flight deck and finally her massive hull. She settled into the Pacific depths at approximately 6 o'clock, carrying with her the hopes of salvage and the bodies of dozens of sailors who had died trying to save her. Yet Yorktown's loss, while tragic, could not diminish the magnitude of American victory at Midway. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, rested on the ocean floor alongside hundreds of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew. The Imperial Navy had lost more carrier aviation capability in 2 days than they could replace in 2 years. Admiral Yamamoto's plan to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead resulted in the destruction of Japan's own naval supremacy. The submarine attack that sank Yorktown represented one of the few tactical successes Japan could claim from the entire Midway operation, but it was far too little to offset the strategic catastrophe that had befallen the Imperial Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aboard the battleship. Yamato received the devastating news of his carrier's destruction with the stoic composure expected of a Japanese naval officer, but those who knew him well could see the profound shock in his eyes. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months to a year, watched his prophecy fulfill itself with tragic accuracy. The statistics were staggering in their completeness. 4 fleet carriers sunk, compared to 1 American carrier lost. 248 Japanese aircraft destroyed, including some of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen killed, representing years of training and irreplaceable expertise. The elite First Air Fleet, which had dominated the Pacific since December 7th, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. But the numbers alone could not capture the true scope of the disaster. Japan's naval aviation program, built over 2 decades of careful development, had been gutted in a single battle. The pilots who died at Midway represented the cream of Japanese aviation, men who had trained for years and fought in China, Pearl Harbor, the East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. Their replacement would require years that Japan did not possess, while American pilot training programs were already producing aircrew in numbers that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and barely survived Akagi's destruction, would later write in his memoir, Midway, "The battle that doomed Japan," that the Imperial Navy never recovered from the losses suffered in those 2 June days. The mystique of invincibility that had surrounded Japanese naval aviation since the China incident was shattered beyond repair, replaced by a growing awareness that America's industrial might and determination made ultimate victory impossible. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding American forces from Pearl Harbor, understood immediately that Midway represented a turning point in the Pacific War. The intelligence breakthrough that had enabled the victory, Lieutenant Commander Rochefort's code-breaking triumph, had proven that American technological and analytical capabilities could overcome Japanese tactical superiority. More importantly, the battle had demonstrated that American forces could not only survive Japanese attacks, but could defeat them decisively when properly positioned and led. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was profound. Emperor Hirohito, upon learning of the disaster, reportedly asked whether the war could continue. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, architect of Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia, began to privately question whether the nation possessed sufficient resources to achieve its strategic objectives. Even Admiral Yamamoto, previously confident in his Navy's abilities, began planning defensive operations rather than the offensive campaigns that had characterized Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor. For the United States, Midway represented validation of a strategy that many had questioned. The decision to rebuild the Pacific Fleet around aircraft carriers rather than battleships, made in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, had proven correct. The emphasis on intelligence gathering and code breaking had yielded dividends beyond the most optimistic projections. Most importantly, the battle had demonstrated that American industrial capacity, properly mobilized, could produce weapons and equipment superior to anything Japan could field. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. With Japan's carrier aviation crippled, American forces could begin planning offensive operations throughout the Pacific. The Solomon Islands, the Marshall Islands, and eventually the Japanese home islands themselves became viable targets for American attack. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed definitively to the United States, never to return to Japan. In the months following the Battle of Midway, the full magnitude of Japan's strategic disaster became increasingly apparent to military leaders on both sides of the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated Asian waters for nearly half a century, found itself forced into an increasingly defensive posture as American industrial might began to demonstrate its overwhelming superiority. The replacement of Japan's lost carriers proceeded with agonizing slowness. The construction of new fleet carriers required years, while the training of replacement pilots demanded even more time that Japan's strategic position could not afford. Meanwhile, American shipyards launched new Essex-class carriers at a pace that stunned Japanese intelligence analysts. The United States, which had possessed only 3 operational fleet carriers at the time of Midway, would commission over 20 new carriers before the war's end. Admiral William Bull Halsey, returning to active duty after recovering from illness, captured the new American mood when he declared that the Pacific Fleet would ride the crest of victory all the way to Tokyo Bay. The defensive mindset that had characterized American strategy since Pearl Harbor gave way to aggressive planning for offensive operations. The first target would be Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, where American forces would test their newfound confidence against Japanese ground troops. Emperor Hirohito, in a rare display of direct involvement in military planning, summoned his senior commanders to explain how Japan's invincible navy had suffered such a catastrophic defeat. The answers they provided, American code-breaking, superior intelligence, tactical errors in timing, offered little comfort to a leader who had been assured that Japanese spiritual superiority would overcome American material advantages. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, lay in ruins on the bottom of the Pacific. The human cost of Midway extended far beyond the statistical casualties. Families throughout Japan mourned sons who had died in the burning carriers, while American families celebrated the return of heroes who had achieved the impossible. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, despite losing Yorktown, was promoted and awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership under fire. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his decisive role in locating and destroying the Japanese fleet. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Midway marked the moment when American leadership recognized that total victory over Japan was not only possible, but inevitable. The industrial capacity that had seemed insufficient to match Japanese expansion was now revealing its true potential. Aircraft production, ship construction, and pilot training programs all accelerated beyond what pre-war planners had considered achievable. As 1942 drew to a close, the strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. Japan, which had spent decades preparing for a short, decisive war against the United States, now faced the prospect of a prolonged conflict against an enemy whose resources seemed virtually unlimited. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, intended to cripple American naval power, had instead awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial and military capabilities would ultimately prove unstoppable. The 4 Japanese carriers that sank at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried with them not only thousands of brave sailors and airmen, but also Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific War. Their loss marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire, and the dawn of American dominance in the Pacific that would reshape the balance of global power for generations to come. The battle that Japan had expected to win decisively instead became the turning point that doomed their empire to ultimate defeat.